The blood on Grace O'Malley's hands wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed them in the creek's cold water. It wasn't her blood, it belonged to her father, who now lay 6 feet under in the unforgiving soil of Whisper Canyon, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The memory of finding him slumped over at their dining table with a bullet hole through his chest haunted her every waking moment, and most of her sleeping ones too. "Papa, I swear on your grave, I'll find who did this to you," she whispered as she finally gave up on removing the stubborn bloodstains ingrained in the creases of her palms. 3 weeks had passed since his murder, and instead of finding justice, she'd found nothing but closed doors and disbelieving stares. Grace was 22, with fiery auburn hair that matched her temperament and green eyes that could pierce through lies like bullets through paper. She'd been raised by her father after her mother died of consumption when Grace was just 7. Patrick O'Malley had been the town's assayer, the man who tested gold and silver claims for miners, and in a booming mining territory like Wyoming, that made him both respected and vulnerable. As the daughter of an assayer, Grace had learned a thing or two about minerals and metals. She'd also learned that in Whisper Canyon, a woman's word meant little without a man to back it up. She packed up her meager belongings, a change of clothes, her father's pocket watch, his old journal, and the small derringer he'd given her for protection, and headed back toward town. She'd already tried telling the sheriff what she suspected, that her father was killed because he discovered someone was salting claims. Salting was the practice of adding gold dust or nuggets to worthless rock to make it appear valuable, then selling the claim at an inflated price. Her father had been looking into several suspicious claims in the weeks before his death. Sheriff Donovan had patted her hand condescendingly. "Now, Miss O'Malley, your daddy likely ran afoul of some drunk miner. Happens all the time. We ain't got no evidence of this." "Conspiracy you're talking about." The bank manager, Mr. Hollister, was no better when she tried to access her father's accounts. "Your father had outstanding debts, Miss O'Malley. I'm afraid the house and all assets must be liquidated." When she protested that her father was the most meticulous man she knew and never would have fallen into debt, Hollister merely adjusted his spectacles and replied, "Grief can cloud a woman's understanding of business matters." By the time Grace reached the edge of town, her resolve had hardened like iron in a forge. She would have to leave Whisper Canyon. There was nothing left for her here but suspicious glances and whispers that she was touched in the head with grief. Her father's killer walked free, probably laughing at how easily they'd gotten away with murder. The stagecoach to Salt Lake City was leaving at noon. Salt Lake City was growing rapidly since the Transcontinental Railroad had come through in '69, and Grace had heard there were opportunities for women there, beyond just marriage or brothel work. With her knowledge of minerals and assaying, she might find respectable employment. As Grace waited at the stagecoach office, she overheard 2 men talking in hushed tones. "Anderson's strike is the biggest this territory has seen. Hollister's bank is backing him all the way. You believe it's genuine? I heard whispers. Keep your voice down." Last fella who questioned Anderson's claim ended up dead. Grace froze. Anderson. Edward Anderson was one of the miners her father had mentioned in his journal, one whose claim he was suspicious of, and now Hollister's bank was involved. The pieces were starting to fit together like a puzzle. The stagecoach arrived with a clatter of hooves and creaking wheels. Grace climbed aboard, clutching her small carpetbag. 5 other passengers were already seated, a prim-looking older woman with her equally proper husband, a traveling salesman with a case of patent medicines, and 2 rough-looking men who eyed Grace with undisguised interest. As the driver called out for any last passengers, A tall figure swung himself into the coach and settled in the last available seat, directly across from Grace. Her breath caught slightly as she took in the newcomer. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy: denim pants, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and boots that had seen many miles. A well-worn Stetson sat atop his head, shading eyes the color of a summer sky. His jawline was strong, with several days' worth of stubble darkening it, and a small scar bisected his right eyebrow. "Afternoon," he said, nodding politely to the occupants of the coach. His voice was deep and had the slight drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. "Matthew Abernathy," he introduced himself when his gaze reached Grace. "Heading to Salt Lake City." "Grace O'Malley," she replied cautiously. "Same destination." The stagecoach lurched forward, beginning the 2-day journey to Salt Lake City. Grace kept to herself, staring out the window as Whisper Canyon receded into the distance. Her mind worked furiously, processing what she'd overheard about Anderson and the bank. If she could somehow prove they were responsible for her father's death, but how? No one in Whisper Canyon would listen to her. Would anyone in Salt Lake City be different? The journey was rough, as expected. The roads were little more than rutted trails in many places, and the stagecoach bounced mercilessly. The first few hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the traveling salesman's occasional attempts to interest his fellow passengers in his miracle cures. When they stopped to change horses at a way station, Grace stepped outside to stretch her legs. The Wyoming landscape stretched out before her, vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. She breathed deeply, trying to clear her head. Running from something or to something? Grace startled. Matthew Abernathy stood beside her, his hat pushed back slightly on his head. "I don't see how that's any of your concern, Mr. Abernathy," she replied stiffly. He shrugged. "It's not. Just making conversation. 2-day journey goes faster with words to fill it." Grace studied him. He didn't seem like the typical rough-edged cowboys she'd encountered in Whisper Canyon. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a thoughtfulness to his manner. "Both, I suppose," she finally answered. "And you?" "Just following work," he said. "Been driving cattle up from Texas to the railheads, but there's talk of better opportunities westward." Before they could continue their conversation, the driver called for everyone to board again. The journey resumed, and as the day wore on, the initial reserve between the passengers gradually thawed. The older couple were Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, traveling to visit their daughter who'd married a Mormon merchant. The salesman, Henry Wilcox, was happy to regale everyone with tales of his travels across the frontier. The two rough men introduced themselves as Curtis and Dahlin, miners heading to new diggings. As the day's light began to fade, Curtis leaned forward, eyeing Grace's carpetbag. "Traveling mighty light for someone moving to a new place," he observed. "Got valuables in there, pretty lady." Grace tensed. "Nothing of interest to anyone but me." Curtis exchanged a look with Dahlin. "Now, don't be like that. We're all friends here." Matthew shifted in his seat, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. "I believe the lady said it's nothing of interest." Curtis sized up Matthew, noting the way his hand rested casually near his hip where a revolver was holstered. After a moment, Curtis leaned back, though his eyes remained watchful. They reached another way station as darkness fell. This one offered basic accommodations: a common room where the male passengers would sleep on bedrolls, and a small separate room with 2 cots for female travelers. A simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits was served, and Grace ate quickly, keeping to herself. After dinner, while the others settled in for the evening, Grace slipped outside with her father's journal. She needed privacy to read through his notes again, to see if there were any clues she'd missed about Anderson and Hollister. Sitting on a bench outside the station, she opened the worn leather journal and began to read by the light of a lantern hanging nearby. Her father's neat handwriting filled page after page with details of claims he'd essayed, notes on ore samples, and occasional personal observations. July 15, Anderson claims showing exceptional yield. Too exceptional. Sample has characteristics of Colorado gold, not local deposit. Need to investigate further. July 28 met with Johnson about Anderson claim. He expressed similar concerns. Will compare notes tomorrow. August 2 Johnson not at meeting. Heard he left town suddenly. Hollister pressuring me to validate Anderson claim officially. Something isn't right. The last entry, dated just 2 days before her father's murder, read, "Evidence compiled. Taking to territorial officials tomorrow. H. Involved deeper than suspected." Grace's hands trembled as she read. This was it, proof that her father had discovered fraud and was about to expose it. And H. Had to be Hollister. Her father was killed to silence him. Interesting reading, Grace gasped and snapped the journal shut. Matthew Abernathy stood a few paces away, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. "You startled me," she said accusingly. "Sorry." He struck a match and lit his cigarette. "Couldn't sleep. Mind if I join you?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. Matthew sat on the opposite end of the bench, respectfully keeping his distance. "Family heirloom?" he asked, nodding toward the journal. "My father's," she replied, then found herself adding, "He was murdered 3 weeks ago." Matthew's expression sobered. "I'm sorry to hear that. Everyone in Whisper Canyon thinks it was just a random killing, a drunk miner, or a robbery gone wrong. But it wasn't. My father discovered something big enough to get him killed for it." Grace wasn't sure why she was telling him this. Perhaps it was the sympathetic look in his eyes, or perhaps it was simply that she'd been holding it in for so long with no one to listen. "And no one believes you," Matthew guessed. "No one even bothered to investigate properly." "Sheriff Donovan dismissed everything I said. The bank is foreclosing on our home, claiming my father had debts, which is absurd. He was the most careful man with money." Grace clutched the journal tighter. "They think I'm just a hysterical woman who can't accept that her father is gone." Matthew took a long draw on his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. "What did your father discover?" Grace hesitated. Should she trust this stranger with information that had gotten her father killed? But something in Matthew's steady gaze made her decide to take the chance. "My father was an assayer in Whisper Canyon. He tested ore samples to authenticate mining claims. He discovered that someone was salting claims, making worthless mines appear valuable by adding gold from elsewhere. He was about to report it to territorial officials when he was killed." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "And you think you know who's behind it?" "A miner named Edward Anderson and the bank manager, Hollister. They're working together somehow." "Anderson's claim is apparently the biggest strike in the territory, but my father suspected the gold wasn't from that mine at all." "That's a serious accusation. Any proof?" Grace held up the journal. "My father's notes. He documented everything." "But it's not enough, not without the actual evidence he gathered. He wrote that he had evidence compiled, but I couldn't find it anywhere in our house." Matthew was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "So you're heading to Salt Lake City to what? Start over? Or find someone who'll listen to your story?" "Both, I suppose. I need work. They've taken everything from me in Whisper Canyon, but I also need justice for my father." Grace's voice broke slightly. "He deserves that much." To her surprise, Matthew didn't offer empty platitudes or dismiss her concerns. Instead, he asked, "These men, Anderson and Hollister, they're powerful in Whisper Canyon." "Hollister runs the only bank for 50 miles. and Anderson's strike has everyone excited about a new boom. They're practically town heroes. Matthew nodded slowly. I've seen it before. Small towns, big money, corrupt men. You believe me? Grace asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Matthew looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious in the lantern light. I believe every word you've said to me today. The simple statement hit Grace with unexpected force. After weeks of dismissal and disbelief, having anyone take her seriously felt like rainfall after months of drought. Why? She asked, unable to help herself. You don't know me. Matthew stubbed out his cigarette. I've been riding the frontier for 15 years, Miss O'Malley. I've learned to read people. You're not spinning tales, you're seeking justice. That's something I respect. Grace swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Matthew said, standing up. Justice is hard to come by out here, but if you're determined to find it, you might need some help. Are you offering? Maybe. Let me sleep on it. He tipped his hat to her. Good night, Miss O'Malley. Good night, Mr. Abernathy. As Matthew walked back into the way station, Grace remained on the bench, clutching her father's journal. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Someone believed her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, the stagecoach resumed its journey at first light. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled westward, the rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain as they approached the Wasatch Mountains. Grace kept mostly to herself, occasionally catching Matthew's eye across the coach. He gave her a slight nod each time, as if to reassure her that their conversation from the previous night wasn't forgotten. Around midday, the stagecoach suddenly jolted to a stop, sending the passengers lurching forward. What's happening? Mrs. Peterson asked nervously. Before anyone could answer, the door was yanked open and a masked man pointed a revolver into the coach. Everyone out. Nice and easy, he demanded. A second masked man on horseback had his gun trained on the driver. Keep your hands where I can see him. The passengers filed out of the stagecoach, hands raised. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she stood in the dusty road alongside the others. Matthew stood slightly ahead of her, his posture alert but not overtly threatening. Wallets, jewelry, valuables, all of it. The first robber commanded, tossing a sack to Mr. Peterson. Put everything in here and pass it along. Mr. Peterson reluctantly dropped his wallet and pocket watch into the sack and passed it to his wife, who added her brooch and wedding ring with trembling hands. When the sack reached Curtis and Dahlan, they exchanged a look before adding their valuables. Dahlan whispered something to Curtis, who smirked in response. Grace felt a chill run through her. Something about their behavior seemed off. The salesman, Wilcox, added a money clip to the sack before passing it to Grace. She hesitated, then dropped in her few remaining dollars. Her father's pocket watch remained hidden in her bodice. She couldn't bear to part with it. When the sack reached Matthew, he calmly placed a worn wallet inside, his eyes never leaving the robber's face. That's it? The robber asked skeptically. That's it, Matthew confirmed. Been a lean season. The robber grunted and turned his attention to the stagecoach's cargo area, where the driver was being forced to unload the mail bags and a small strongbox. Grace noticed Matthew's eyes scanning their surroundings, assessing. His hand hovered near his holster, which the robbers had surprisingly not demanded he remove. Don't try anything foolish, Grace whispered urgently. Wouldn't dream of it, Matthew replied softly. Just being aware. The robber with the sack suddenly turned to Grace. You're holding out on me, Red, I can tell. Grace stiffened as he approached her. I gave you all I have. Nah, pretty thing like you must have something valuable. His eyes roved over her figure suggestively. Maybe I need to search you more thoroughly. Matthew stepped forward slightly. She's given you what she has. The robber's attention snapped to Matthew. You looking to be a hero, cowboy? Just stating a fact, Matthew replied evenly. The tense moment was broken when Curtis suddenly called out, "Hey, there's someone coming." The robbers turned to look down the road, and in that instant, several things happened at once. Matthew's hand flashed to his holster, drawing his revolver with lightning speed. At the same moment, Curtis pulled a hidden gun from his boot and aimed not at the robbers but at Matthew. Grace shouted a warning. Matthew spun, firing a shot that caught Curtis in the shoulder just as Curtis's own gun went off, the bullet whistling past Matthew's ear. The first robber turned back, raising his gun toward Matthew, but froze when he found himself staring down the barrel of Matthew's Colt. "Drop it," Matthew ordered, his voice deadly calm. The second robber, still on horseback, started to raise his rifle, but the stagecoach driver, seizing the opportunity, pulled a shotgun from beneath his seat and aimed it at him. "I wouldn't," the driver warned. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the first robber lowered his gun to the ground. The mounted robber similarly lowered his rifle. "Now dismount," Matthew instructed the second robber. "Slow and easy." As the robber complied, Dalan suddenly made a move toward his fallen partner's gun. Mrs. Peterson, showing surprising presence of mind, stuck out her foot, tripping Dalan and sending him sprawling in the dust. Within minutes, the driver and Matthew had the situation under control. The robbers were bound with rope from the stagecoach, as were Curtis and Dalan. "You two were working with them," Matthew stated, looking at the miners. Curtis glared up at him, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You can't prove nothing. Don't need to. The territorial marshal in Salt Lake City will sort it out." Matthew turned to the driver. "How far are we from the next station?" "About 2 hours," the driver replied. "We can make it by sundown if we push the horses." Matthew nodded. "These 4 can ride up top with you. I'll keep watch." As the other passengers collected their valuables from the discarded sack, Grace approached Matthew. "That was impressive," she said quietly. Matthew holstered his gun. "Not my first encounter with road agents. You knew Curtis and Dalan were involved, suspected." "They were too interested in what everyone was carrying. Probably planned to rob us themselves if these other 2 hadn't beaten them to it." Matthew gave her a slight smile. "You've got good instincts, by the way. That warning saved my hide." Grace felt warmth spread through her cheeks at his praise. "Lucky observation." "No such thing as luck in my experience, Miss O'Malley. Just preparation meeting opportunity." He gestured toward the stagecoach. "Shall we continue our journey?" The mood in the stagecoach was markedly different after the robbery attempt. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson regarded Matthew with open admiration, while Wilcox couldn't stop recounting the excitement to anyone who would listen. Grace found herself watching Matthew with new eyes. He wasn't just a sympathetic ear, he was a man of action, someone who could handle himself in dangerous situations. As they continued toward Salt Lake City, Grace's mind returned to her father's murder and the corruption in Whisper Canyon. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that with Matthew's help, she might actually be able to bring her father's killers to justice. The stagecoach arrived in Salt Lake City the next afternoon. The growing city was a stark contrast to the small mining town Grace had left behind. The wide streets were busy with wagons, carriages, and pedestrians. Brick buildings lined the main thoroughfares, and in the distance, the partially constructed Mormon temple rose above the cityscape. When they reached the stage depot, Matthew helped Grace down from the coach. "What are your plans now?" he asked as the driver handed down her carpet bag. "Find lodging, then work," she replied. "After that, I'm not sure." Matthew nodded. "There's a decent boarding house on 2nd Street, Mrs. Harper's place. Tell her Matthew Abernathy sent you. She'll treat you fair. You're not staying in the city?" Grace asked, surprised and a little disappointed. "Got business to attend to first, but I'll be back in Salt Lake in about a week." Matthew hesitated, then added, "If you're still interested in pursuing justice for your father, I might be able to help." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Matthew's expression grew serious. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to lose someone to violence and have no one believe your version of events." Before Grace could ask what he meant, a man approached them, calling out to Matthew, "Abernathy, about time you showed up." The newcomer was in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a tailored suit that marked him as someone of means, and a badge gleamed on his vest. "Marshall Parker," Matthew greeted him. "Right on schedule, actually." The marshal's eyes moved to Grace, then back to Matthew with a raised eyebrow. "Marshal, this is Miss Grace O'Malley," Matthew introduced her. "Miss O'Malley, this is United States Marshal James Parker." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "A pleasure to meet you, Marshal." "Likewise, Miss O'Malley." The marshal tipped his hat to her. "Abernathy, we need to discuss the Whisper Canyon situation." Grace felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Whisper Canyon." Matthew and the marshal exchanged a look. "Miss O'Malley is from Whisper Canyon," Matthew explained. "Her father was Patrick O'Malley, the assayer who was murdered 3 weeks ago." Marshal Parker's expression changed to one of keen interest. "Patrick O'Malley's daughter. Miss, I've been trying to piece together what your father was investigating before his death." "You have?" Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Your father sent a letter to the territorial governor's office a month ago, expressing concerns about fraudulent mining claims. He was gathering evidence when he was killed." The marshal looked at her intently. "I don't suppose you know what happened to that evidence?" Grace shook her head. "I've been trying to find it myself. I have his journal, but the actual evidence he collected, I don't know where it is." The marshal looked disappointed but nodded. "I see. Well, that journal might still be useful." He turned to Matthew. "We have a lot to discuss, Abernathy." Matthew nodded, then turned to Grace. "Miss O'Malley, would you be willing to speak with Marshal Parker about your father's investigation? It could be important." "Of course," Grace replied without hesitation. "Anything that might help bring his killers to justice." "Good," said the marshal. "I'm heading back to my office now. Both of you come with me. We have much to talk about." As they walked toward the marshal's office, Grace's mind raced with questions. How did Matthew know the marshal? What was the Whisper Canyon situation they mentioned? And most importantly, was it possible that she might finally find justice for her father? The marshal's office was a tidy space with a desk, a gun cabinet, and several wanted posters adorning the walls. Once they were seated, Marshal Parker wasted no time getting to the point. "Miss O'Malley, I need to be direct with you. Your father wasn't just investigating a simple case of claim salting. Based on his communications with the governor's office, he believed he had uncovered a major fraud operation involving multiple claims, significant amounts of money, and possibly even territorial officials." Grace nodded. "That matches what I gathered from his journal." He mentioned a man named Anderson specifically, and the bank manager Hollister. "Edward Anderson, yes, and George Hollister. They're part of it, but we believe there are others involved, more powerful people." The marshal leaned forward. "Your father was going to bring evidence to us the day after he was killed." "How is Matthew involved in all this?" Grace asked, glancing at the cowboy. Matthew and the marshal exchanged another look before the marshal spoke. "Mr. Abernathy works with me occasionally on sensitive matters. He's not a deputy marshal officially, but he has certain skills that are useful in investigations." "You're some kind of lawman?" Grace asked Matthew directly. Not exactly, Matthew replied. I've done various jobs over the years. Sometimes I help the marshal when he needs someone who can move around without drawing attention. Marshal Parker continued, We've been investigating suspicious mining operations throughout the territory. Large claims are being sold to Eastern investors at inflated prices. When the investors discover the claims are worthless, they find that the sellers have vanished with their money. And you think my father uncovered this scheme in Whisper Canyon? Grace asked. We know he did, the marshal confirmed. What we don't know is exactly what evidence he had or where he kept it. Without that evidence, it's difficult to build a case against Anderson, Hollister, or anyone else involved. Grace opened her carpet bag and pulled out her father's journal. This is what I have. There might be clues in here about where he hid the evidence. The marshal accepted the journal with reverence. This could be extremely helpful, Miss O'Malley. Thank you. As the marshal began to thumb through the journal, Matthew turned to Grace. This is why I was headed to Whisper Canyon. The marshal asked me to investigate quietly, see what I could learn about your father's murder and the mining fraud. So meeting me on the stagecoach was just coincidence. Grace felt strangely disappointed. Completely, Matthew assured her, but a fortunate one. You know Whisper Canyon, you knew your father and his work. You could be a valuable ally in this investigation. The marshal looked up from the journal. There's a notation here about a safety deposit in the usual place. Any idea what that might mean? Grace thought hard. My father did business with several banks in larger towns, not just Hollister's bank in Whisper Canyon. He didn't trust Hollister, especially in the last few months. You know which banks? The marshal asked. He mentioned Rollins and Cheyenne in his letters to me when I was at school in Denver, Grace replied. And I know he traveled to Salt Lake City occasionally for business. Marshal Parker made a note. I'll have my deputies check those locations. In the meantime, Miss O'Malley, I'd like you to stay in Salt Lake City. You could be in danger if the people who killed your father learn you're pursuing this. I have nowhere else to go, Grace said simply. My home in Whisper Canyon is being foreclosed on. I recommended Mrs. Harper's boarding house, Matthew interjected. It's safe and respectable. The marshal nodded approval. Good choice. Now, Abernathy, I still need you to go to Whisper Canyon as planned. With what we've learned from Miss O'Malley, you'll have a better idea of what to look for. Matthew nodded. When do you want me to leave? Tomorrow morning. The sooner the better. The marshal turned back to Grace. Miss O'Malley, would you be willing to work with us on this investigation? Your knowledge could be invaluable. Of course, Grace replied without hesitation. Whatever it takes to bring my father's killers to justice. Good. The marshal stood. Abernathy, get Miss O'Malley settled at the boarding house, then come back here. We have details to discuss before you head to Whisper Canyon. As they left the marshal's office, Grace's mind was reeling with this unexpected turn of events. She'd come to Salt Lake City seeking a fresh start, never imagining she'd find allies in her quest for justice. I should have told you who I was on the stagecoach, Matthew said as they walked toward the boarding house. But I needed to be careful. Didn't know if you might be connected to the people we're investigating. I understand, Grace assured him. I'm just grateful to have finally found someone who takes my father's murder seriously. She glanced at him curiously. How did you come to work with Marshal Parker? Matthew's expression grew distant. Long story. The short version is that years ago, my brother was killed by men who were never brought to justice. Marshal Parker was one of the few lawmen who believed my account of what happened. He helped me track down the killers eventually, and afterward, he suggested I could help him with similar cases. I'm sorry about your brother, Grace said softly. It was a long time ago, Matthew replied. though his tone suggested the wound wasn't completely healed. "But it's why I understood your determination to find the truth. I've been where you are." They arrived at the boarding house, a well-maintained three-story building on a quiet street. Mrs. Harper turned out to be a plump, efficient widow in her 50s who regarded Matthew with fond exasperation. "Abernathy, what trouble are you bringing to my doorstep this time?" she asked, though her eyes twinkled with affection. "No trouble, Mrs. Harper, just a lady in need of lodging," Matthew replied with an easy smile. "Miss Grace O'Malley recently arrived from Whisper Canyon. Mrs. Harper assessed Grace with sharp eyes that softened as they took in her modest dress and determined expression. "Any friend of Matthew's is welcome here," she declared. "I have a lovely room on the second floor. Monthly rate is reasonable, and it includes breakfast and dinner." After brief negotiations, Grace was shown to a clean, comfortable room with a window overlooking the street. Mrs. Harper left her to settle in, promising dinner would be served at 6. "Mrs. Harper is good people," Matthew said when they were alone. "You'll be safe here." "Thank you," Grace said, setting her carpetbag on the bed, "for everything." Matthew shifted uncomfortably at her gratitude. "I haven't done anything yet." "You believed me," Grace replied simply. "That's more than anyone else has done." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Matthew cleared his throat. "I should get back to the marshal. We need to plan my approach in Whisper Canyon." "Be careful there," Grace warned. "If Anderson and Hollister realize you're investigating them." "I've done this kind of work before," Matthew assured her. "No one will connect me to the marshal or to you. I'll be just another cowboy looking for work." "When will you return to Salt Lake City?" "A week, maybe 2, depending on what I find." Matthew hesitated, then added, "I'll come find you as soon as I'm back." Grace nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at his words. "I'll be here, or at the marshal's office. I plan to help however I can with the investigation." Matthew tipped his hat. "Until then, Miss O'Malley." "Until then, Mr. Abernathy." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. She'd arrived in Salt Lake City, expecting to start a new life alone. Yet somehow she'd found allies in her quest for justice, and perhaps something more in the steady gaze of a cowboy who believed her when no one else would. The next week passed in a blur for Grace. She found employment at a respectable assayer's office on Main Street, thanks to a letter of introduction from Marshall Parker. Her knowledge of minerals and assaying procedures, learned at her father's side, impressed Mr. Fleming, the proprietor, enough that he hired her as an assistant despite initial reservations about employing a woman. In the evenings, she spent hours at the marshal's office, going through her father's journal with Deputy Marshal Collins, a serious young man assigned to the case while Marshall Parker was away on other business. They carefully mapped out connections between names mentioned in the journal and known mining claims in the territory. "Your father was methodical," Deputy Collins commented one evening as they worked. "These notes are incredibly detailed." "He always said that, in assaying, precision is everything," Grace replied, a sad smile touching her lips. One small error in measurement could mean the difference between a worthless rock and a fortune in gold. Despite the progress they were making with the investigation, Grace found her thoughts often drifting to Matthew. Was he safe in Whisper Canyon? Had he discovered anything useful? The concern she felt went beyond the case in the brief time she'd known him. Matthew Abernathy had come to occupy a surprising amount of her thoughts. Mrs. Harper noticed Grace's preoccupation at dinner one evening. "Thinking of our mutual friend, are you?" she asked with a knowing smile. Grace blushed. "I'm just concerned about the investigation. "Of course you are," Mrs. Harper replied, not fooled for a moment. "Well, you needn't worry too much. Matthew Abernathy is as capable as they come. I've known him for 5 years, and I've never seen him fail at a task he's set his mind to." "How did you meet him?" Grace asked, curious about this connection. Mrs. Harper's expression softened with memory. "He helped my nephew out of a bad situation. Boy got involved with the wrong sort of gang that was robbing stage coaches. Matthew could have turned him in, but instead, he gave him a chance to make it right. My nephew's working an honest job in California now, thanks to him. He seems to have a habit of helping people in difficult situations," Grace observed. "That he does." Mrs. Harper studied Grace for a moment. "He's a good man, Miss O'Malley, one of the best I know. But he carries burdens from his past, same as many who have lived hard lives out here." Grace nodded, thinking of what Matthew had told her about his brother's murder. "We all have our ghosts to contend with." 10 days after Matthew's departure, Grace was working late at the assayer's office, completing documentation for a particularly complex ore sample, when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, expecting to see Mr. Fleming returning from his dinner break. Instead, Matthew Abernathy stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the evening light. His clothes were trail-worn, and several days' growth of beard darkened his jaw. He looked tired but alert. "Mr. Abernathy," Grace exclaimed, rising from her desk. "You're back." "Miss O'Malley." Matthew removed his hat as he stepped inside, revealing hair that needed a good wash. "I was told I might find you here." Grace tried to calm the sudden racing of her heart. "You've just returned from Whisper Canyon, rode straight here from the marshal's office." Matthew glanced around the assayer's shop. "Found employment, I see. Mr. Fleming was kind enough to hire me based on my experience with my father." Grace studied Matthew's face, noting the new lines of fatigue around his eyes. "What did you discover in Whisper Canyon?" Matthew's expression grew serious. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately? What I found is significant." Grace nodded and moved to lock the front door. "Mr. Fleming won't be back until tomorrow morning. We can speak freely here." She led Matthew to the back office, where a small stove provided warmth against the evening chill. 2 chairs faced a cluttered desk covered with ledgers and ore samples. "Can I offer you coffee?" she asked, gesturing to the pot keeping warm on the stove. "I'd be much obliged," Matthew replied, sinking gratefully into one of the chairs. As Grace poured the coffee, she noted how Matthew's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, a habit, she suspected, born of years of needing to be aware of his surroundings. "Here," she said, handing him a steaming mug. "Now tell me what you found." Matthew took a long sip of coffee before speaking. "Your suspicions were correct. Anderson and Hollister are definitely involved in the fraud, but they're not the top of the operation. They answer to someone bigger, a man named Victor Randall." Grace frowned. "Randall? I don't recall my father mentioning that name. He's not in Whisper Canyon. He's based here in Salt Lake City." Matthew leaned forward. "Randall is a mining investor with connections to the railroad and several banks throughout the territory. He's been orchestrating these fraudulent claims across Wyoming and Utah for at least 3 years. And my father discovered the connection." Matthew nodded. "According to what I learned, your father noticed similarities between ore samples from supposedly different mines. He began documenting these similarities, which led him to question the authenticity of Anderson's claim. When he started asking questions about where Anderson was shipping his ore and who was financing the operation, he became dangerous to them. Grace felt a cold knot form in her stomach. So they killed him." "Hollister gave the order," Matthew confirmed grimly. "Hired a man named Silas Jenkins to do it. Jenkins is a known gun for hire in those parts. Jenkins, Grace repeated, the name burning into her memory. And he's still in Whisper Canyon, he was, until yesterday. Matthew's expression darkened. There was an incident. Jenkins recognized me asking questions about your father's death. He tried to ambush me outside the saloon. Grace gasped. Were you hurt? No, Jenkins wasn't so fortunate. Matthew's tone was matter-of-fact, but Grace could see the tension in his jaw. It was self-defense, witnessed by half the town. The local sheriff couldn't dispute it, even though he's in Hollister's pocket. So Jenkins is dead, won't be killing anyone else's father. Matthew met her eyes directly. I'm not proud of taking a life, Miss O'Malley, but I won't apologize for defending myself. Grace reached across the desk and placed her hand on his, a gesture of understanding and solidarity that surprised them both. My father's killer has faced justice. That's something, at least. Matthew turned his hand to briefly clasp hers before releasing it. It's not enough, though. Jenkins was just a hired gun. The real culprits are Hollister, Anderson, and especially Randall. They're the ones who need to answer for your father's murder. What about the evidence my father gathered? Did you find any trace of it? Nothing in Whisper Canyon, but I did learn something interesting. Matthew pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. This was hidden in a secret compartment in your father's desk. Hollister's men must have missed it when they searched the house. Grace unfolded the paper to find a letter addressed to her father from the First National Bank of Salt Lake City, acknowledging receipt of items for his safety deposit box. My father had a safety deposit box here in Salt Lake City, she breathed. The usual place the marshal found mentioned in his journal. Exactly, and the date on that receipt is just 4 days before his death. Matthew's eyes gleamed with the excitement of the hunt. Whatever evidence he gathered, I'd bet my last dollar it's in that box. But how do we access it? The bank will require proper documentation, perhaps even a court order since my father is deceased. Marshal Parker is working on that. He's requesting the necessary papers from the territorial court. Matthew finished his coffee. With luck, we'll have access within a few days. Grace felt a surge of hope. After weeks of despair, justice for her father finally seemed within reach. What happens once we have the evidence? Marshal Parker will build a case against Randall, Hollister, and Anderson. With your father's documentation and what I learned in Whisper Canyon, we should have enough to bring charges. Matthew's expression grew somber. But be prepared, Grace. Randall is powerful. He has connections in Salt Lake City, possibly even within the territorial government. It was the first time he'd called her by her first name, and Grace found she liked the sound of it on his lips. I'm not afraid, she said with determination. These men took everything from me, my father, my home. I won't rest until they face justice. Matthew studied her face, admiration evident in his eyes. You're a remarkable woman, Grace O'Malley. The compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. I'm simply doing what my father would have expected of me. He taught me to stand up for the truth, no matter how difficult. He raised you well. Matthew rose from his chair. I should let you finish your work, and I'm in desperate need of a bath and proper meal after 10 days on the trail. Mrs. Harper will take good care of you, Grace assured him, standing as well. Will I see you tomorrow at the marshal's office? Count on it. Parker wants us both there at 9. Matthew hesitated, then added, would you perhaps join me for dinner tomorrow evening, to discuss the case further, of course. The slight uncertainty in his voice, so at odds with his usual confidence, touched something in Grace's heart. I'd like that very much. Matthew smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his trail-weary face. Good, I'll call for you at the boarding house at 6. As he turned to leave, Grace called after him. Matthew, he paused, looking back at her. Thank you for believing me for everything." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow could be a big day." After he left, Grace found it nearly impossible to concentrate on her remaining work. Her mind kept returning to the revelations Matthew had shared, and to the way her name sounded when he spoke it. True to his word, Matthew was waiting at the marshal's office when Grace arrived the next morning. The transformation from the trail-worn cowboy of the previous evening was remarkable. He'd bathed, shaved, and donned clean clothes, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a new-looking vest. His hair was neatly combed, though still long enough to curl slightly at his collar. Marshal Parker was reviewing documents at his desk, his expression serious as they entered. "Miss O'Malley, Abernathy, good morning," he greeted them. "We have developments." "Regarding the safety deposit box?" Grace asked eagerly. "Yes, and more." The marshal gestured for them to sit. "I've secured a court order to open your father's box at First National. We can access it this afternoon." Grace felt a surge of anticipation. "That's wonderful news." "There's more," the marshal continued, his expression grave. "One of my informants has learned that Victor Randall is aware we're investigating him. Someone in Whisper Canyon sent word after Abernathy's confrontation with Jenkins." Matthew cursed under his breath. "I was careful, but small towns have eyes everywhere." "It's not your fault," Marshal Parker assured him. "This was bound to happen eventually, but it means we need to move quickly. Randall is a dangerous man when cornered." "How dangerous?" Grace asked, a chill running through her. The marshal and Matthew exchanged a look before Parker replied. "Randall has been implicated in at least 2 suspicious deaths, besides your father's former business partners whose deaths were ruled accidents. We've never been able to prove his involvement." "So he could come after us," Grace concluded, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "It's a possibility we need to consider," the marshal acknowledged, "which is why I'm assigning a deputy to stay with you until this is resolved." "I don't need," Grace began to protest. "I'll watch over her," Matthew interrupted, "if you can spare me from other duties." The marshal raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well. You're familiar with the case and the players involved, but be vigilant, both of you. Randall doesn't get his hands dirty directly, but he employs men who do." At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the 3 of them entered the First National Bank of Salt Lake City. The marble floors and polished brass fixtures spoke of wealth and stability, a far cry from the humble surroundings of Whisper Canyon's bank. The bank manager, Mr. Harrington, was expecting them. He personally escorted them to the vault after reviewing the court order and Grace's identification. "Your father was a valued client, Miss O'Malley," he informed her as they walked. "I was deeply saddened to hear of his passing." "Thank you," Grace replied, wondering if her father had confided his suspicions to the banker. "Did my father visit this bank often?" "Several times a year. He maintained accounts with us for over a decade." Mr. Harrington unlocked the heavy vault door. "He was always particular about his safety deposit box, insisted on accessing it personally, never through a proxy." Inside the vault, Mr. Harrington used his key in combination with the key from the court documents to open a medium-sized box. He then discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone with the contents. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found several leather-bound folders, a small wooden box, and a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's familiar handwriting. Her throat tight with emotion, Grace opened the envelope first. "My dearest Grace," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears were justified and I have met with foul play. What I have uncovered is a conspiracy of greed that reaches to the highest levels of business and perhaps government in this territory. Grace read the letter aloud, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Her father detailed his investigation into the mining fraud, how he'd connected multiple seemingly unrelated claims across Wyoming and Utah to a single operation run by Victor Randall. The evidence in these folders proves beyond doubt that Randall, working through local men like Hollister and Anderson, has defrauded investors of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The ore samples in the wooden box demonstrate how they've been salting worthless mines with gold from a single source, likely Randall's legitimate mine in Colorado. The letter concluded, "I entrust this evidence to you, my daughter, knowing your strength and determination. Take it to the territorial authorities. Be careful, these are dangerous men who will not hesitate to silence those who threaten their operation. I love you always. Your father, Patrick." When she finished reading, the vault was silent except for the sound of her own uneven breathing. Marshall Parker gently took the folders and began examining the contents. "This is even more comprehensive than I hoped," he said after several minutes. Detailed financial records showing money transfers between Randall's various enterprises. Documentation of the actual mineral content of mines versus what was reported to investors. Even affidavits from 2 miners who participated in the fraud and later regretted their involvement. "Will it be enough to prosecute?" Matthew asked, examining one of the ore samples from the wooden box. "More than enough," the marshal confirmed. "This evidence, combined with what you gathered in Whisper Canyon, gives us a solid case against all of them: Randall, Hollister, Anderson, and several others mentioned in these documents." Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "My father didn't die in vain. His work will bring these men to justice." "We need to move quickly," Marshall Parker said, gathering the materials. "I'll send telegrams to have Hollister and Anderson arrested in Whisper Canyon immediately, and I'll request a warrant for Randall's arrest here in Salt Lake City." "Where is Randall now?" Matthew asked. "He has a home on South Temple Street and offices on Main Street. My deputies will check both locations." The marshal carefully packed the evidence into his satchel. "I want both of you to stay out of sight until we have Randall in custody. Go back to the boarding house and remain there." Matthew nodded. "We'll be careful." As they left the bank, Grace felt both vindicated and vulnerable. Her father's killer, at least the man who had pulled the trigger, was dead, but the true architects of his murder were still at large. Until they were arrested, she remained in danger. Matthew seemed to sense her unease. As they walked through the busy streets, he stayed close beside her, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His hand occasionally brushed against hers, a subtle reassurance of his presence. "Do you really think Randall would come after me?" Grace asked quietly as they turned onto a less crowded side street. "A man like Randall doesn't get where he is by leaving loose ends," Matthew replied grimly. "Especially now that we have evidence that could send him to prison." Grace nodded, accepting this harsh reality. "At least now I understand why my father was so careful in his last letters to me. He must have suspected he was being watched. Your father was a brave man. Taking on powerful men like Randall took courage." Matthew glanced at her, admiration in his eyes. "You're very much like him." The compliment warmed her despite the tension of the moment. "I hope so. He was the best man I've ever known." They walked in companionable silence for a few blocks before Matthew suddenly stiffened, his pace slowing. "What is it?" Grace asked, immediately alert. "Don't look back," Matthew instructed quietly. "But we're being followed. 2 men about half a block behind us. They've been with us since we left the bank." Fear shot through Grace, but she kept her expression neutral and her pace steady. "What do we do?" Turn left at the next corner. There's a mercantile there with a back exit that leads to an alley. I know the owner." Matthew's voice remained calm, but his hand moved to rest near his holster. "If they follow us into the store, we'll know for certain they're after us." They made the turn and entered Donaldson's Mercantile, a busy establishment filled with shoppers. Matthew nodded to the proprietor, a burly man with impressive whiskers, who returned the greeting with a look of recognition. "Abernathy, haven't seen you in months," the man called out. "Afternoon, Donaldson. Mind if we use your back door?" Trying to avoid an unwelcome conversation. Matthew's casual tone belied the tension Grace could feel in his posture. Donaldson's eyes narrowed slightly in understanding. "Of course. Through the storeroom, same as always." "Much obliged." Matthew guided Grace toward the rear of the store with a light touch at her elbow. They had just reached the storeroom door when the shop bell jingled. Grace risked a glance back to see two men enter, hard-looking fellows in dark clothing, who scanned the store with predatory focus. "That's them," she whispered to Matthew. "Go," he urged, opening the storeroom door. "Quickly." They moved through the cluttered storeroom and out the back door into a narrow alley. Instead of turning toward the main street, Matthew led Grace in the opposite direction, through a maze of back alleys and service passages. "Where are we going?" Grace asked breathlessly as they emerged onto a residential street several blocks from the mercantile. "Changing our route to the boarding house," Matthew explained. "If they're Randall's men, they'll know where you're staying. We need a safer location." "The marshal's office," Matthew shook his head. "Too obvious. I have another place in mind." He led her through a series of turns that left Grace thoroughly disoriented. Eventually, they arrived at a modest house on a quiet street on the outskirts of town. Matthew approached the door and knocked in a distinctive pattern. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Her expression brightened when she saw Matthew. "Matthew Abernathy. It's been too long," she exclaimed before noticing Grace and the urgency in Matthew's manner. "Sarah, we need a place to lay low for a few hours," Matthew said. "It's related to Marshall Parker's business." Understanding immediately, Sarah ushered them inside. "Of course. The spare room is ready as always." "This is Miss Grace O'Malley," Matthew introduced once they were safely inside. "Grace, this is Sarah Weaver, an old friend and the widow of my former ranger captain." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Weaver," Grace said, still catching her breath from their hurried journey. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Nonsense, dear. Any friend of Matthew's is welcome here." Sarah closed and locked the door behind them. "Are you in danger?" "Potentially," Matthew confirmed. "We need to stay out of sight until Marshall Parker secures an arrest." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "You know where everything is, Matthew. I'll make some coffee." As Sarah moved to the kitchen, Matthew led Grace to a small parlor. "We should be safe here. Sarah's husband was a Texas Ranger and she's helped hide witnesses before." "You have interesting friends," Grace observed, sinking gratefully into a chair. "Comes with the territory." Matthew moved to the window, carefully positioning himself to see out without being visible from the street. "I should get word to the marshal about what happened." "Will those men be able to track us here?" "I don't think so. We took a roundabout route and this house isn't connected to me in any official way." Matthew turned to face her. "I'm sorry about dinner. This isn't exactly what I had in mind." Despite the tension of the situation, Grace found herself smiling. "Perhaps another time when we're not fleeing from dangerous men." Matthew returned her smile, a warm expression that reached his eyes. "I'll hold you to that, Miss O'Malley." Sarah returned with coffee and some simple food, which Grace accepted gratefully. As they ate, Matthew explained their situation more fully to Sarah, who listened with the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to dangerous circumstances. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed," Sarah assured them. "The spare room is ready, and I can make up the sofa for Matthew." "Thank you, but hopefully this will be resolved quickly," Matthew replied. "I just need to get word to the marshal." Sarah offered to deliver a message, and Matthew quickly wrote a note detailing their situation and location. After she left, Matthew and Grace settled into an uneasy wait. "Tell me about your life before all this," Matthew said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "Your father mentioned you were at school in Denver," Grace nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Yes, Miss Porter's Academy for Young Ladies. My father insisted I receive a proper education, even though it meant being away from home for much of the year. That couldn't have been easy for either of you. It wasn't, but he wanted me to have opportunities he never had." Grace smiled at the memory. "He used to say, Grace, the world is changing, and women won't always be confined to kitchens and nurseries. You need knowledge to make your way in that new world." He sounds like a forward-thinking man. He was. "He taught me a saying when I was just 12, saying there was no reason a woman couldn't understand minerals as well as a man." Grace's expression grew sad. "The irony is that he sent me to that finishing school to give me choices, but in the end, I'm using the skills he taught me anyway." "Do you regret that?" Matthew asked. Following in his footsteps, Grace considered the question. "No, I love the work. There's something satisfying about testing a sample, applying the right processes, and discovering exactly what it contains. It's like solving a puzzle." Matthew nodded in understanding. "And you're good at it." "Very good," Grace replied without false modesty. "Mr. Fleming has already said he'd like to expand my responsibilities at the assay office, though I suspect he's still somewhat scandalized by having a female assistant. He'll get over it when he sees the quality of your work." Matthew's tone was matter-of-fact, his confidence in her abilities apparent. Their conversation continued easily, moving from Grace's education to Matthew's experiences as a cowboy, Texas Ranger, and occasional assistant to Marshal Parker. Grace found herself drawn to his straightforward manner and quiet intelligence. Unlike many men she'd met, Matthew spoke to her as an equal, never talking down or simplifying matters he thought might be beyond her understanding. As evening approached, Sarah returned with news from the marshal. "Parker says they've arrested Anderson in Whisper Canyon and they have men watching Hollister. But Randall has disappeared. He wasn't at his home or office, and his staff claim not to know where he's gone." Matthew's expression darkened. "That's not good. If Randall's in the wind, he could be anywhere, including on his way to find Grace." "The marshal wants you to stay hidden until they locate Randall," Sarah continued. "He's doubled the guards at all stagecoach and train stations, but Salt Lake is a busy place." "We'll stay put," Matthew agreed. "Sarah, are you sure it's safe for you to have us here? If Randall's men tracked us to Donaldson's store, they might eventually find this place." Sarah's expression was resolute. "My John would never turn away someone in need, and neither will I. Besides, this old girl isn't defenseless." She patted the pocket of her apron where Grace could see the outline of a small pistol. As night fell, the house grew quiet. Sarah showed Grace to the spare bedroom, a simple but comfortable space with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window. "There's a nightgown in the dresser that should fit you," Sarah told her. "It belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Oregon." "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Weaver," Grace said sincerely. Sarah patted her hand. "It's nothing, dear, and please call me Sarah." She hesitated, then added with a knowing smile, "Matthew is a good man, you know, one of the best." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes that doesn't matter. When it's right, it's right." Sarah's eyes twinkled. I saw my John once across a crowded church social and told my mother, that's the man I'm going to marry. She thought I was touched in the head, but I was right. After Sarah left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, too restless for sleep, despite the exhaustion of the day. Her life had changed so dramatically in the span of a few weeks, from the sheltered daughter of an assayer to a woman pursued by dangerous men, with only a cowboy she barely knew standing between her and harm. And yet, she didn't feel afraid. Concerned, yes. Vigilant, certainly. But not afraid. Something about Matthew Abernathy's steady presence gave her confidence that they would weather this storm. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Grace, are you still awake?" Matthew's voice was low. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his expression serious. "I just wanted to check on you," he said. "Make sure you're all right." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Tired, but fine." Matthew nodded, seemingly reluctant to leave. "If you need anything during the night, I'll call for you," she promised. Then, acting on impulse, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Matthew, for everything." His fingers closed briefly around hers, warm and strong. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow could be another long day." As he turned to go, Grace felt a sudden certainty that, whatever happened with Randall and the investigation, her life was irrevocably entwined with Matthew Abernathy's now. And strangely, that thought didn't frighten her at all. Grace woke to the sound of hushed voices. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, indicating she had slept later than usual. Quickly donning her dress from the previous day, she made her way to the kitchen, where she found Matthew and Sarah in serious conversation with Marshall Parker. All three looked up as she entered. "Miss O'Malley, good morning," the marshal greeted her. "I hope you slept well despite the circumstances." "Well enough, thank you," Grace replied, her eyes questioning as she looked between the three grave faces. "What's happened?" "We've had developments," Marshall Parker said. "Some good, some concerning. Hollister was arrested in Whisper Canyon last night. He's being transported here to stand trial alongside Anderson." "And Randall?" Grace asked, already suspecting the answer from their expressions. "Still missing," Matthew answered grimly, "but we have a lead." A station master at the Southern Depot recalls a man matching Randall's description boarding a train to Provo yesterday afternoon. "Provo? What would he want there?" Grace wondered. "He has business interests throughout the territory," Marshall Parker explained, "including a smelting operation near Provo. It could be he's seeking to destroy evidence before we can seize it. Or he could be gathering resources for a counterattack," Matthew suggested. "Men, weapons. Either way, we need to find him," the marshal said firmly. "I'm sending a team of deputies to Provo today." "I should go with them," Matthew volunteered. "I know what Randall looks like." Marshall Parker hesitated. "Normally, I'd agree, but I'm concerned about Miss O'Malley's safety. With Randall still at large, she remains a target." "I can't hide forever," Grace objected. "I have work, responsibilities. And surely with Hollister and Anderson in custody, the immediate danger is reduced." "Randall is the most dangerous of the three," the marshal countered. "He has the resources to hire men to do his bidding, even from a distance." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Collins, who burst into the kitchen with an urgent expression. "Marshal, there's been a development." A night watchman at the First National Bank was found unconscious this morning. The vault was broken into overnight. Grace's heart sank. "My father's safety deposit box, emptied," Collins confirmed, along with several others, presumably to make it look like a common robbery. "Damn it." Marshall Parker slammed his hand on the table. "He's trying to destroy the evidence against him." "But we already have the contents," Grace pointed out. "The evidence is safe with you." "Yes, but Randall doesn't know that," Matthew said, understanding dawning on his face. He thinks the evidence is gone, which means he might return to Salt Lake City, thinking the threat is neutralized. Marshall Parker finished the thought. This could work in our favor. A plan was quickly formulated. Deputies would still be sent to Provo to investigate Randall's smelting operation and possible hideout, but the marshal would also set a trap in Salt Lake City. Word would be carefully leaked that the bank robbery had succeeded in destroying crucial evidence in a pending case. We'll use Randall's confidence against him, the marshal explained. If he believes he's safe, he might return to his home or business here where we'll be waiting. And what about Miss O'Malley? Matthew asked, concern evident in his voice. I want her kept safe, but also visible, Marshall Parker replied. If Randall or his men are watching, they need to believe she's abandoned her pursuit of justice without the evidence. Grace straightened her shoulders. You want to use me as bait? Not exactly, the marshal hastened to say. But we need you to go about your normal activities, work at the assay office, return to the boarding house. Make it appear that, without your father's evidence, you've accepted defeat. While being carefully watched by your deputies, I assume. Grace's tone was dry. By me, Matthew said firmly. I'll stay with Grace. Marshall Parker nodded his agreement. Very well, but both of you need to be extremely careful. Randall is desperate now, which makes him even more dangerous. The plan was set into motion immediately. Grace returned to Mrs. Harper's boarding house long enough to change clothes and collect what she needed for work, with Matthew as her constant shadow. They then proceeded to the assay office, where Mr. Fleming was surprised but pleased by her return. I was beginning to worry, Miss O'Malley, he said as she took her place at her desk. It's not like you to miss work without notice. I apologize, Mr. Fleming. There was an urgent family matter, Grace replied, the half-truth coming easily. She gestured to Matthew, who stood near the door. This is Mr. Abernathy, a family friend who's visiting from Wyoming. I hope you don't mind if he stays while I catch up on my work. Mr. Fleming eyed Matthew's gun belt with slight apprehension but nodded. As long as he doesn't interfere with business. Throughout the day, Grace focused on her work, analyzing ore samples and completing documentation, while Matthew maintained a vigilant watch. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the room, and Grace would feel a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with their dangerous circumstances. As evening approached, Mr. Fleming departed, leaving Grace to lock up. She was finishing the last of her paperwork when Matthew, who had been watching the street from the window, suddenly tensed. Grace, he said quietly, we have company. Grace looked up, alarm coursing through her. Randall. No, but men who work for him, I'd wager. Matthew moved away from the window. 2 men across the street watching the office, same ones who followed us yesterday. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers. What do we do? Stick to the plan. Act normal. Matthew checked his revolver, then replaced it in his holster. We'll leave together, head straight to the boarding house as if we don't notice them. And if they follow, they will, and Marshall Parker's men will be watching them. Matthew came to her desk, his expression serious. Are you ready for this? Grace nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. Yes. As they stepped outside, Grace locked the office door with deliberate calm, though her heart was racing. Matthew offered her his arm, a gesture both protective and meant to convey normalcy to any watching eyes. Don't look toward them, he murmured as they began walking. Just keep your eyes ahead and talk to me as if we're having a casual conversation. Grace forced a smile. So, Mr. Abernathy, how are you finding Salt Lake City compared to Wyoming? Considerably more civilized, Matthew replied, playing along while his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Though I admit I miss the open spaces. They continued their pretend conversation as they walked, Grace acutely aware of the men following at a distance behind them. The boarding house was 6 blocks away, each step taking them further from the safety of public streets into quieter residential areas. "They're getting closer," Matthew said softly as they turned onto 2nd Street. "Be ready to move quickly if I say so." Grace's grip on his arm tightened. "Where are the marshal's men? I don't see anyone watching us." "They're there, trust me." Matthew's voice remained calm, but his body was tense like a coiled spring. They were just a block from the boarding house when Matthew suddenly stopped, his head turning sharply toward an alley they had just passed. "What is it?" Grace whispered. Before Matthew could answer, a man stepped out from the alley directly in front of them. Unlike the rough men who had been following them, this man was expensively dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots. His silver hair and beard were immaculately groomed, and he carried a walking stick with a silver handle, but the revolver in his hand destroyed any image of gentility. "Miss O'Malley, I presume," the man said, his cultured voice at odds with the threat in his eyes. "And Mr. Abernathy, Marshal Parker's attack dog." Matthew moved slightly, positioning himself partly in front of Grace. "Victor Randall, you're a long way from Provo." Randall smiled coldly. "A necessary deception. I never left Salt Lake City, merely sent a man who resembles me to create a false trail." He gestured with his revolver. "Now, both of you will accompany me. We have matters to discuss regarding Patrick O'Malley's unfortunate demise." Grace felt a surge of anger override her fear. "You murdered my father." "A regrettable business necessity," Randall replied without remorse. "Your father was a threat to a very profitable enterprise, as you have become." "Where are your men, Randall?" Matthew asked, his hand hovering near his holster. "Keeping Marshal Parker's deputies occupied on the other side of town." Randall's smile widened. "A small fire at the courthouse has drawn quite a crowd. Now, shall we?" "We're not going anywhere with you," Grace declared, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm afraid I must insist." Randall raised his revolver, pointing it directly at Grace. "Mr. Abernathy, I suggest you remove your weapon slowly and drop it. Otherwise, Miss O'Malley will suffer the same fate as her father." Matthew's expression hardened, but he slowly reached for his gun. "That's it," Randall encouraged. "Nice and easy." As Matthew's hand closed around his revolver, a voice suddenly called from behind Randall. "Drop your weapon, Randall." U.S. Marshal. Randall spun around, his gun swinging toward the new threat. In that instant, Matthew drew his revolver with lightning speed and fired. Randall staggered as the bullet struck his shoulder, his own gun discharging harmlessly into the ground. He fell to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder as Deputy Collins and 2 other deputies rushed forward to secure him. "Are you both all right?" Collins asked as he handcuffed the groaning Randall. "We're fine," Matthew answered, holstering his weapon. His arm went protectively around Grace's shoulders. "Good timing, Collins." "The marshal suspected Randall might try something like this," Collins explained. "We've been watching you both all day, along with Randall's known associates." Grace looked down at Randall, who glared up at her with undisguised hatred. "This man ordered my father's death, and he'll hang for it," Collins assured her. "With your father's evidence and testimony from Hollister and Anderson, who are already turning on each other to save their own necks, Randall won't escape justice." As the deputies led Randall away, Grace suddenly felt the events of the day catch up with her. Her knees weakened and she swayed slightly. Matthew's arm tightened around her. "Easy there, it's over now." "Is it really?" Grace asked, looking up at him. "After all these weeks, is it finally over?" "The danger is," Matthew confirmed. "Randall, Hollister, Anderson, they'll all face trial and almost certainly hang for your father's murder and the fraud scheme." Relief washed over Grace in a wave so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "He has justice. My father has justice." Matthew guided her gently toward a nearby bench where they sat as Grace composed herself. His arm remained around her shoulders, a warm, steady presence that anchored her as emotions surged through her: relief, vindication, grief, and a tentative hope for the future. "What happens now?" she finally asked, wiping away the last of her tears. "Now you can live your life without looking over your shoulder," Matthew replied. "Continue your work at the assay office, make a home here in Salt Lake City." "And you?" Grace asked, suddenly fearful that with the case resolved, Matthew would disappear from her life as quickly as he had entered it. "What will you do now?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful as they met hers. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether there might be a reason for me to stay in Salt Lake City." His voice softened. "A reason beyond horses and cattle and occasional work for Marshall Parker." Grace felt her heart quicken. "And what reason might that be, Mr. Abernathy?" "A remarkable woman with fire in her hair and courage in her heart." Matthew turned slightly to face her more directly. "A woman I've come to admire greatly in a very short time." "We barely know each other," Grace whispered, echoing her words to Sarah from the night before. "We know what matters," Matthew countered. "We know about courage and determination, about seeking truth no matter the cost, about standing by someone when they need you most." He took her hand gently in his. "I'd like the chance to learn the rest if you're willing." Grace looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity and something more, a tenderness that made her breath catch. In the span of less than 2 weeks, this man had believed in her when no one else would, had protected her at risk to himself, had helped bring her father's killers to justice. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that very much, Matthew Abernathy." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I reckon I'll be staying in Salt Lake City for a while." As the sun set over the city, casting golden light across the streets, Matthew leaned forward and gently kissed Grace. It was a kiss of promise, of possibilities, of a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met on a stagecoach bound for Salt Lake City. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Grace stood in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, placing flowers on a newly installed headstone. Patrick O'Malley's remains had been moved from Whisper Canyon at her request, given a proper burial in the city where his daughter had found both justice and a new beginning. "He would have liked you," Grace said to the man standing beside her. "He always said I should find a man who respected my mind as much as my heart." Matthew squeezed her hand gently. "I wish I could have met him." "In some ways you did," Grace replied. "Through his journal, his work, through me." She touched the simple gold band on her left hand, a new addition as of the previous week, when she and Matthew had exchanged vows in a small ceremony attended by Marshall Parker, Sarah Weaver, Mrs. Harper, and Grace's new colleagues from the assay office. The trial of Victor Randall and his accomplices had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, with guilty verdicts for all involved. Randall, Hollister, and the hired gun Jenkins, posthumously, were convicted of Patrick O'Malley's murder, while additional convictions for fraud and corruption ensured none would ever walk free again. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Abernathy?" Matthew asked, offering his arm. Grace smiled at her new name, still a delightful novelty. "Yes, I believe I am." Their home was a modest but comfortable house not far from the assay office where Grace continued to work. To her surprise and delight, Mr. Fleming had recently proposed a partnership, impressed by her knowledge and skill. Abernathy and Fleming Assayers would soon replace the old sign above the door. Matthew had found his place as well. dividing his time between occasional assignments for Marshall Parker and managing a small horse breeding operation outside the city. His expertise with horses had quickly earned him respect in Salt Lake City's growing business community. As they walked arm in arm through the streets of the city they now called home, Grace reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A murder, a stagecoach journey, a man who said 7 simple words that changed everything. "I believe every word you've said to me today." "Penny, for your thoughts?" Matthew asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Grace smiled up at him. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now from what I imagined when I first left Whisper Canyon. Disappointed." There was a teasing light in his eyes, but Grace caught the hint of genuine question beneath it. "Not in the slightest," she assured him, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk to face him directly. "I came to Salt Lake City seeking justice and a fresh start. I found both in something I wasn't even looking for." "And what was that?" Matthew asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "You," Grace replied simply. "A partner, someone who believes in me." She reached up to touch his face. "Someone I love." Matthew covered her hand with his own. "Your father would be proud of you, Grace, not just for bringing his killers to justice, but for the woman you've become, strong, independent, unafraid to forge your own path." "Our path," Grace corrected gently. "We're forging it together now." As they continued toward home, the setting sun painting the Wasatch Mountains in shades of gold and purple, Grace felt a deep contentment settle in her heart. The pain of her father's loss would never completely disappear, but it had been eased by justice and by the unexpected gift of love that had come from the darkest chapter of her life. In the years that followed, Grace and Matthew built a life together that honored Patrick O'Malley's memory while creating new traditions of their own. Their assaying business thrived as mining operations expanded throughout Utah Territory. They welcomed 2 children, a son named Patrick, after Grace's father, and a daughter, Emily, whose fiery hair and determined spirit marked her as her mother's daughter. Matthew continued to assist Marshall Parker occasionally, his tracking skills and cool head under pressure proving valuable in the most difficult cases. Grace sometimes joined these investigations when they involved questions of mining or mineral identification, forming a partnership with her husband that extended beyond their personal life. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of their home with the children asleep inside, Grace and Matthew would often recall the remarkable series of events that had brought them together: a murdered father, a stagecoach journey, and a cowboy who chose to believe a determined woman's story when no one else would. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met on that stagecoach?" Grace asked one such evening, her head resting against Matthew's shoulder as they watched the stars appear above the mountains. "Sometimes," Matthew admitted, his arm tightening around her. "But then, I remember something my mother used to say, that some souls are meant to find each other, no matter what obstacles stand in their way." Grace smiled, thinking of the unlikely circumstances that had brought them together and the strong bond that had formed so quickly between them. "I think she might have been right." "I know she was," Matthew replied with certainty, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Some things are just meant to be." And as the stars shone down on the city they now called home, Grace knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together: the assayer's daughter and the cowboy who believed her when no one else would.